Howdy Commanders, welcome to On and Off Paper, a guide for things to think about when playing as and against particular ships in World of Warships Legends. I'm Echo Drummer, and today we're taking a look at the Tier 3 French tech tree destroyer, the Bourrasque. Before we get into the ship, we're going to take a look at the commander build that's going to be influencing all of the numbers that we'll be taking a look at. On my Bourrasque, I'm running a level 12 Legendary 1 PHILIPPE AUBOYNEAU. His base trait, Powder Keg, increases your main battery HE shell damage, giving you an even better Alpha Strike and DPM than these ships already have. Slot 1, I'm running Subsurface Venture. Yes, you take a slight nerf to the main battery reload, but the 4 knots of speed and 12% torp reload reduction is great. Slot 2, I'm running Fragile Threat. These are pretty thick ships in terms of hit points. You got a lot to play with, so sacrificing a little bit of them for some better detectability is not a bad idea in my book. Slot 3, running Torp Safari. Keep in mind that he is only 12 Legendary 1, so both this and Fragile Threat have room to grow. So the stats you'll see are not final, and they will be even better once AUBOYNEAU is leveled up. In slot 4, I actually don't have a skill picked because, Smoke on the Water will do me absolutely no good, and Destroyer Be Destroyed, I'm not the biggest fan of making my main battery accuracy worse. If you felt inclined to take this skill and make the ship even faster, I would suggest taking a high-level Burke as one of your inspiration slots to offset the main battery accuracy nerf. And of course, in Legendary slot, we're running Unstoppable because it's a destroyer and you run Unstoppable. For inspirations, I'm running a 16 Legendary 2 Arachbe for the concealment, and a 15 Legendary 2 Azure Lane Atago for the Torp concealment. I understand many of you do not have Azure Lane Atago. She is coming to the store before the end of this update cycle, so keep that in mind. For those of you that want to acquire her, that'll be a way to do it. However, if you don't feel inclined or do not already have Atago, some other suggestions for a second inspiration would be a high-level Vian for that increased incoming shell dispersion. You will get shot at in this ship. It's difficult to disengage quickly because you don't have a smoke screen, as we'll talk about more later. So a high-level Vian to decrease the number of shells that are going to hit you in the first place is a great option. A high-level Trubetskoy is another good option, particularly if you are inclined to run Fragile Threat in slot 2. Yes, trading off base starting hit points and reducing your incoming damage are not exactly the same thing, but taking 5 to 6% less damage on a slightly lower health pool is not a bad way to go. As we mentioned, Burke would be a good option. You do use the guns a lot in these. They have a high alpha strike, but not the greatest DPM. It's not quite an accuracy by volume type of ship, so you definitely want to make those shots count, especially if you are going to run Destroyer Be Destroyed in slot 4. That would be probably my top suggestion if you are going to run Destroyer Be Destroyed. And lastly, a fourth option I would say, if you have him, is a high-level Swirsky. You can really double down on concealment if you want to. Make that blue ring even smaller and make this boat an absolute terror. You will outspot basically everything. They will never see you coming. You will alpha strike them and they will die. Next, we're going to take a look at the boat build. Keep in mind that I do have all 3 of the upgrade slots installed: B-hull, torp upgrades, and range modification. For our only available module slot, slot 1, I am running aiming systems because, as I mentioned, that accuracy of the main battery is extremely important with a high alpha strike, but not the greatest DPM. You definitely want to make every shell count. Moving on to the stats. Checking out survivability first, we've got 10,820 hit points. Keep in mind that is with a Fragile Threat, that's why it ends at kind of a weird number like that. It is second only to the Clemson with a whopping 10,900 hit points. Now, as we mentioned, Fragile Threat will be going up, which means we'll lose an additional 2.5% of hit points, but still will be the second most at the tier. That 10 millimeters of maximum armor is fairly thin-skinned. Only the Wakeful at Tier 3 has 10 millimeters of armor matching the Bourrasque. Everything else has thicker maximum plating. What this means is that all of these small caliber main batteries that you see on these destroyers down here at tiers 2, 3, and 4 are still going to be able to detonate their HE and do damage to you. So though you have a lot of hit points, you do not have much in the way of armor for protecting those hit points, and rarely will your enemy shatter on you. We'll switch over to actually looking at the boat to talk about a few other things when it comes to survivability. The turrets are well shrouded. If we zoom in here, they have these hoods over them. They're not fully turreted per se, but the main batteries are well hooded or shrouded with these armor encasements. Not fully enclosed. You can see they're off the back there. You can still see part of the gun. It's not a full true turret like you'll find at upper tiers, but these are great shrouds. Better than anything else at the tier. Most of the boats at tier 3, even quite a few of them at tier 4, don't even have shrouds, much less full turrets. So relative to the tier, these are very well protected guns. As well as your Alpha and Zulu turrets have these little lips overhanging a little bit of them there, as you can see near the bottom of the screen in this view. So, you know, depending on the shell trajectory and angle of approach, enemy shells might hit that armored lip and not hit your Alpha and Zulu turrets, which will help keep them that much more well protected. Along that same line, there is this little wall here between the Torp turrets. This little wall will probably mean that a single enemy shell is very unlikely to damage and or completely disable both torpedo launchers at the same time. The ship is fairly large in silhouette. If we zoom all the way out here, rotate around, this is a fairly large ship in silhouette for the tier. It is in fact the largest in silhouette by the tier by a considerable margin. Your height off of the water before the deck starts, and the maximum height of your deck off of the water is the tallest at the tier. Additionally, your superstructure is huge. You've got 3 relatively large funnels and sort of some superstructure near the rear as well. All of this means that when shells are coming at you relatively flat, close in, you know, kind of skimming along the waterline, you're easy to hit from this kind of side silhouette profile view. But you're relatively skinny from the front and from the rear. So when you're kiting or going nose in, you're relatively hard to hit. As well as, because you're so skinny, shots kind of plunging at range are much less likely to hit you because you have that sort of small deck profile. Shifting back now to artillery, you've got 4 single turrets as we saw earlier, 130 millimeters. These are the largest at the tier. That range there at 9.1 is boosted by a triple chevron battle booster. This is sort of middle of the pack for the tier. Not the best, not the worst. The reload time is the 3rd worst at the tier, 7.3 seconds on this build, only to the Wakeful and Isokaze with my builds. Some cruisers that you're going to be fighting are faster, so that is something to watch out for. Your Alpha Strike, however, with 1,962 HE shell damage is absurd. It's second only to the Clemson after the Clemson puts its upgrades on in terms of Alpha Strike. And you're tied for the best HE fire chance at the tier with the Wakeful. So what this means is, in package, your HE shells, I would argue, are the scariest at the tier. Between the second highest Alpha Strike and the second highest HE. Now the DPM is not the greatest because of that slow reload. It's about half that of a Clemson. So what this means is you really can't stand toe-to-toe and trade blows with ships like the Clemson and several others at the tier. It's more about the kind of Alpha Strike initial punch, more like almost like a battleship in that way. The ballistics on these shells are not the best, but they're not the worst. They're fairly floaty, but they are extremely accurate. If you have your aim and lead dialed in, you could definitely make this Alpha Strike type ship hit pretty hard. And that 2300 AP shell damage is nothing to sneeze at. If you catch one of these low-tier cruisers broadside, it doesn't take much. They'll be at the bottom pretty quickly. One of the main balancing things with these guns is the pretty much trash firing angles. As you can see here, the front turrets do not angle to the rear hardly at all, and the rear turrets towards the front are even worse. What this means in practice is that to get all 4 of these guns on target, you have to basically give a flat broadside, and because you're giving flat broadside and you have the largest silhouette at the tier, this is a recipe for high risk but high reward. Keep that in mind. Shifting back to the torps, we'll look at those. This is where, in my opinion, this boat shines the brightest. You got 2 triple torp launchers, both center mounted, that reload every 64 seconds. This is Clemson-esque, so for those of you that were familiar with that boat, it feels much like that. 11,267 damage is pretty hard hitting for the tier, and you will find that you often deal close to that max damage because there's very little torp reduction on the ships that you will be launching these torps at. The range of 8.3 kilometers is the best at the tier, and the speed is the second best at the tier, only to the Wakeful on my builds by a whopping 1 knot. Combine all of that with the 1 kilometer detection influenced by the Azure Lane Otago. This gives you a torp reaction time of 6.2 seconds, which is amazing. The battleships at the tier do not have the target acquisition mod in slot 3. There is no slot 3 module slot on these battleships down here at this tier, with the exception of a few premiums, I believe. But for the most part, your tech tree battleships don't have that, which means that 6.2 second reaction is absolutely terrifying, gives them basically no time to get out of the way of these 11,200 plus damage trucks that are the Bourrasque torpedoes. Combine all of that with the relatively narrowish spread of those triple launchers and the fact that these torps stay closely grouped even out at that 8.3 kilometer range means that you're going to be landing quite a few of these torps. It's not infrequent that you land 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5, or even all 6 of the 6 torps. Now these torps are balanced with pretty atrocious angles. We go back to look at the ship real fast. The angles to the front of your torp launchers are not very good. I would describe them as pretty bad. To the rear are considerably better. So when we look at the fact that the front guns fire better to the rear than the rear guns fire to the front, and the fact that the torps fire better to the rear than they do to the front, these two things are signaling to you captains out there that this boat definitely wants to be used as a kiting type of boat and fighting a sort of moving away type of retreating fight as it harasses and kites the enemy. One particular thing of note on these torps is that the front torp launcher rotates through the rear and the rear torp launcher rotates through the front. What this means in practice is that sometimes you'll be shooting your main batteries off of one side, the torps will be pointed in that same direction, and then maybe you'll want to snap shoot some torps off the other side because there's a target over there that you want to use them on. And one torp launcher will go the short way around and get there quickly, and the other one will have to go the long way around, making it a little more difficult to kind of snap shoot both launchers in quick succession. Not something that's unworkable. It's definitely fine. It's not that big of a pain, but it is something to consider. It may come up here and there. If we shift back to the stats page on maneuverability, somehow these French destroyers have picked up a reputation of being extremely quick, speed demons. And here on the tech tree, this appears to not quite be the case up and down most of the line. In fact, this Bourrasque, I had to check and recheck these numbers because I just was in disbelief. But this 34 knot max speed on the Bourrasque is the lowest at the tier among destroyers. I didn't believe it. However, where the ship does shine in terms of maneuverability is its acceleration and deceleration. The time to top speed from 0 is 30 seconds, and the time to stop from top speed is 15 seconds, and your time to full reverse from a dead stop is 10 seconds. Keep in mind those numbers are acquired while traveling only in a straight line with no rudder at all at any point. With rudder, obviously, some of those numbers will go up and some of them will go down. You can stop faster, but it'll take you longer to accelerate. However, when talking about acceleration with the rudder on, the ship still accelerates relatively quickly even at a hard over rudder. And you can maintain a 3/4 or even above 3/4 throttle speed even when the rudder is hard over one side or the other. A 3-second rudder shift time is relatively snappy. I rarely find myself wanting for better rudder shift in this ship. You flip it over and it flips right back to neutral really quickly. The 560 turning circle is a bit on the large side, but it's not unmanageable. And again, when you consider that sort of rapid acceleration, rapid deceleration, you can use the sort of start and stop turn to tighten up your turn circle mechanic quite effectively in this boat. If you think back to the Duck of War mode that we had around April Fool's Day, for those that were around during that, this boat, more than any other in the game so far, feels the most like those Duck of War boats. If you remember, those could basically start and stop on a dime and had almost no lag in their, you know, time to top, time to stop. Now, obviously, this Bourrasque is not quite like that, but if you were to compare all the ships to those Duck of War ships, this one is the one that definitely comes the closest. This means that this ship lends itself really well to sort of baiting out shots from your enemy, starting and stopping and dodging them in that way, especially since to get all your guns on target, you have to give a lot of broadside. You definitely want to be on and off the throttle, on and off the throttle, to try to get your enemy to shoot ahead of you, shoot behind you, shoot ahead of you, shoot behind you, etc. Lastly, down to concealment, 4.8 concealment. Again, this will get better as my fragile threat goes up, but it's sort of comparable to a V170 at the tier, and if you're running a double concealment build, there's a very good chance that you're the stealthiest thing at the tier. Your smoke fire penalty of note is 2.2 kilometers. This is because of those 130s. Everything else at the tier has a 2.0 smoke fire penalty. This won't come into play terribly often on this boat because you don't have your own smoke, but it may come up. Half of your guns are positioned forward of the midpoint of the ship, and half of them are positioned to the rear of the midpoint, so you can equally abuse that midpoint concealment mechanic from the front or the rear. The torps are just barely to the rear of that midpoint, so it's a little harder to abuse that in terms of the torp usage and that center point concealment, but it is still doable with both launchers. You are the tallest ship at the tier, as we sort of alluded to several times before. What this means is that you may find it hard to find islands that can block you compared to other ships at the tier. They may be able to use islands to block line of sight that you cannot, but this also does have a upside to it in that if they are behind an island, they may be able to see you, but you might be able to see them as well. They may be so low and close to the water that though you're spotted, they may not be able to shoot you behind that island because they're so close to the water their guns are just hitting the island, whereas you are sitting slightly up above the island and able to shoot kind of down and over it. Lastly, we'll take a look at the consumables. You'll notice the curious lack of smoke screen. This ship doesn't have its own smoke. You're just relying on everyone else's that's floating around out there. But it does have this amazing 20% speed boost. Lasts for 2 minutes. That 171 second cooldown is influenced by that triple chevron combat flag, but normally it's 180 second base. That means with this 20% engine boost on this build, you can get up over 40 knots at tier 3. So what does all this mean? What do all these stats mean? What is the role of this ship? Well, I think that this ship lends itself really well to stealth torping. As you can see, my blue detectability ring is quite tight into the ship, and the white torp max range is quite a ways away from my ship. And both of those numbers will be getting better as I level up AUBOYNEAU a little bit more. The ship is great at recon. You can kick that speed boost on, use that good concealment to get out on the flanks and do some reconnaissance spot for your team. It's definitely a support ship in terms of launch the torps in at the broadsides of things, maybe land a few, start floods, start fires with your high HE chance on the fire chance on those shells. And you know, I definitely picture and use this ship as sort of the cavalry to the rest of the Navy. You kind of get in fast, hit really hard, and then get out. You know, kind of run and gun, get spotted, fight for a moment, use that high alpha strike, drop spot. You're definitely not a ship that wants to remain spotted. You're relatively easy to hit. You don't have a high DPM on this boat, so you definitely want to sort of run and gun, use an island, shoot right before you get behind it, and then drop spot immediately thereafter, maybe get behind a smoke screen, etc. As we mentioned before, since the rearward angles are better than the forward angles on all your armaments, this is definitely a ship that lends itself better to kiting rather than going nose in. And lastly, in terms of matchups, before we look at some gameplay footage, mirror matches, it's okay. Definitely comes down to captain's skill, as we mentioned with that sort of starting and stopping, getting the enemy to miss. That's where it's going to come into play when you're fighting other Bourrasques. The Alpha Strike will beat this ship up, and that thin armor will not be able to protect it. So if the other captain is better at shooting than you, and you are not that great at dodging and making him miss, he will beat you. It pretty much slays all Tier 2 destroyers that it can come up against. It's great against Tier 3s in terms of Alpha Strike. It does not get into a slugging match with a Clemson terribly well, because the Clemson's DPM is basically double that of the Bourrasque. And at Tier 4, the Jaguar and Farragut are fairly scary, just because of their better gun handling and output and DPM. So with regards to those ships, you definitely have to use hit and run tactics. You know, you kind of outspot the Farragut, and you'll be able to hit him and run, hit him and run. Try to bait his shot so he gets spotted, and the rest of the team can hopefully support you and take him out. Alright, we're going to get into some gameplay here. A domination game on Trident. This was actually the final game I had to play in this ship to finish out its XP grind and unlock the Tier 4. As you can see in the bottom left corner there above the game timer, I'm playing in a division with Terra Wolfpack and DB, a couple guys I play with pretty frequently. So as soon as we load in, you can see that bit of a fail platoon here with an Izzy and Bourrasque with a Tier 4 Kamikaze. Took a roll of the dice. I was fairly confident, this being the last game of this ship, in my ability to hang with Tier 5s if I absolutely had to, especially if I had a Kamikaze with me. Did luck out on the roll of that dice, so we are fighting 3s and 4s. We spawn in the northwest spawn on Trident with the Alpha Bravo Charlie running west to east. So we got our triple destroyer division, and we're taking off for Alpha here. We're checking the team list on the enemy team. We see there is a 2-man division, also both in destroyers on the enemy team. We're pushing into Alpha. Just kind of keeping an eye out, see what happens, see what develops. Decent amount of cruiser threat on the enemy team, with 3 cruisers. Combine that with the 4 destroyers to give them eyes and ears. It is fairly risky to push too far forward too quickly here. We see Carl gets spotted fairly early, coming into our cap area. DB in the Kamikaze slightly ahead of me launches torps. I wait for him to clear me. I launch torps on the indicator on the Congo. If you notice, I did one slightly to the near side of the ship of the center of that gray aiming cone, and then the second set of torps was slightly to the away side of that indicator. Assuming that the ship that I'm aiming at continues on its current trajectory, it'll kind of eat those first set of torps and then keep moving and eat that second set of torps. This is a strategy that you can employ to kind of maximize the number of torps that you land. I've tried to turn the commentary down a little bit, what was actually being talked about in the game here amongst us, but I did leave it in because in a few spots we can kind of hear each other's crosstalk. There you can see a great example of the alpha strike on that Podvoisky. For tier 3 guns, I mean, that was a heck of a hit. Over 1,000 damage in a single salvo on a destroyer at this tier is just absurd. You can see good guy cruiser on our team came in with a good hit. Terra lands a nice couple sets of torps on the Podvoisky there, takes him down. And in not too short order, we've done a great job on this flank. I'm going to pull into DB's smoke here. He dropped some kamikaze smoke for me. It's not the best smoke at the tier, but it's pretty solid. At this distance, you're practically point blank to a Congo. Not quite YOLO territory, but it might as well be. We've got a fire going on him with the guns. That's that great 9% fire chance at work there. Congo takes 3 torps there, as well as a flood. You can hear me calling this out to my teammates in the background, letting them know that the Congo is vulnerable to dots. He's got double fire and a flood. He's going down quickly. He's got no support over here. He's in a really bad way. Almost feel bad for him losing all of his friends. Almost. We get credit for the kill there due to our multiple dots. It stands for damage over time. That'd be your fire and flood ticks. We're going to pull into the alpha cap here to secure it. The enemy team secured Charlie over on the east side. We do have a guy in Bravo and a plane circling to help with spotting in that area as well. So the opening gambit has been completed by both teams. I pull up the strategic map and team list to gather some data. Bit of a breather moment for us here on the western flank as we wrap up capping Alpha. You'll also see me in a moment look at the health of my teammates and division mates. And then our mics will all start lighting up as we begin planning our next moves for the mid phase of the game. And here's a good example. You can see here Terra in the Izyaslav in front of me, how when I don't have my speed boost active is significantly faster than me in a straight line. This is one of the things I didn't quite mention terribly well in the maneuverability section of the port review, is that at any given tier these French destroyers are probably most vulnerable to being run down by the Soviet destroyers. In a straight line, when the French don't have their speed boosts on, and the Soviets do, those Soviets can definitely run these French destroyers down pretty quickly. DB's going north to provide destroyer spotting up north to our teammates up there. We do have a cruiser up there, as well as the cruiser in Bravo. We're chatting about the game situation, talking about the fact that one of their destroyers, as you can see, they've got last spotted indicators for 2 of them, but on the team list at the top, they still have 3 enemies alive. That means one of their destroyers has been completely unspotted for the whole game. Enemy Omaha pulling into Bravo here from Charlie. Getting a little too close to our friendly cruiser there. We open up on Omaha to reduce the damage he's doing. And you can see there another good salvo on Omaha. You see that alpha strike at work again. Yet again, over 1,000 damage in a single salvo. Dougie's going to take the torps there, and Omaha's going to get a flesh wound and high caliber for his efforts. Good on him. Doing what he had to do near the end. He knew he was going to go down. He got his torps off to take Dougie out, give his teammates a better chance. We're tied on ship count. We're up 2 caps to 1, but our lead is slim, though it is growing. This game is still losable, could go in anybody's favor. With over half the game left, there's still too much clock to sit on our laurels. We've still got to be aggressive. This is one thing that a lot of teams kind of fail to do. They fail to recognize that, sure, they may have a lead, maybe they're up a ship or 2 even, maybe they're up a cap, but there's either too much game clock left, or the pieces, if you will, are in bad positions on the game board, and the game is still very losable, or in fact is about to be switched from a lead to a losing situation. Here we see the V-170 that had been unspotted as up until now finally pops up on the map. I was originally going to go into Charlie here and remain quiet and just try to torp the battleship, but I realized that these guys need my Alpha Strike help here. So I'm actually going to intentionally keep the throttle up to keep maneuverability in case anybody decides to shift guns at me. But I wait until that island indicator, that, you know, you're about to beach indicator, collision imminent, and then I slam the brakes on and sort of intentionally beach just in order to keep my guns going at that DD as long as I could without going through this gap where I had originally been pointed. So that was a sort of, you know, some people call it tactical beaching, intentional beaching, where you're kind of doing one thing and then the situation changes rapidly and you have to intentionally beach in order to respond to that situation. During that last exchange, we could also see an example of the higher floatier shell arcs of the French DDs compared to the Izyaslaw's rail guns. He was only a kilometer closer than me, but his shells were much closer to the water than my shell arcs. I thought this Arkansas was going to turn in towards me when I launched these torps, but instead he turned away, so there's no way they're going to hit. The other two DDs are still floating around out there. We're up on points a little bit more now just because we've had the 2-to-1 cap lead and now they're not getting any points from Charlie. So there you can hear me tell the teammates that I'm going to hold my fire. The reason I'm not shooting here is I don't want Acosta to reset me. If I lose one or both of my teammates, this game could very well come down to caps and points, and we need to get this Charlie cap as quickly as possible. And in order to do that, I can't get reset. To avoid getting reset, I'm going to hold my fire here. Acosta smokes up, and now we're going to use this smoke against him. I don't have smoke, but there's still smoke on the map. I can use it against you. And I'm telling my teammates that, so I'm going to try to keep the smoke between me and the Acosta, and me and the battleship for that matter. My teammates are spotting Acosta, and I'm shooting at Acosta. We're over 50,000 damage already. Still 3 ships, including a mostly full health Arkansas on the board. And you can see that for the tier, this ship is just able to crank out the damage. V-170 does take Terra down, unfortunately. And in quick order, we retaliate on the Reds and take one of their teammates down. We're tied on ships. Arkansas is worth more points than us as a destroyer, but we're also up 3 caps to none. We've got a 250 some odd point lead, and that's growing very rapidly. You can see the points ticking up there quickly. And now this Arkansas is in a bad way. He's got 6 torps from a kamikaze coming every 30 some odd seconds, and 6 torps from me that hit like an absolute truck every 60 seconds. And we're at sort of a L-shape ambush to him. If you look directly off my stern is where the Arkansas is, and then directly off the Arkansas's bow is where DB is in the kamikaze. So he's in a bit of an L-shape ambush, so he can't really angle to both of our torps at once. If he turns in to dodge one of our torps, he's going to take the torps in the broadside from the other of us. You can see there we land 2 torps, get a flood, get high caliber. High caliber is a medal that I got more often than not in this ship. Well over half the games. I think of the 8 or 9 I played in this ship, I got high caliber 5 or 6 times. And that's largely due to the torps and then also the high alpha strike. Land a lot of fires, especially on ships that have damage con floods, so you tend to rack up the damage pretty quickly. So we're just chatting about what we're going to do about this Arkansas, trying to stay alive, making sure we don't die, talking about the fact that V-170 went into Bravo. DB nearly takes out the Arkansas there. As we mentioned, you know, Arkansas had to turn to avoid DB's torps as best he could, but that meant he basically turned right into mine. And if he had the health, he would have taken 5 torps of my 6. Excuse me. 4 torps of my 6. Granted, only one had to hit him to finish him off, but that's what we were talking about when we were in port. You know, 4 ships or 4 torps there would have landed on that guy, potentially even a dev strike from full health there. So we were at nearly max range on the launch when we sent those out at him. That's what I'm talking about with that detectability and tight firing angles. You tend to land a lot of torps in every salvo. Now we're just chatting about what this V-170 is possibly doing, where he might be, and then we see that he's flipping Charlie. So he's low health. We learned that from Tara. I didn't know his health. This is a perk of playing in a division, is, you know, even after a guy is dead, he can provide you intel, he can provide you spotting, especially on bigger maps at higher tiers when you can't see friendly or enemy health, even though that information would be available if you were closer. So I just kind of blindly fire torps into the cap. I even tell DB and Tara, like, I'm going to shoot torps in here, give them something to think about. Pop up on spot pretty much at the same time. We have largely the same detectability. I think maybe only 100 meters difference. Hit him with some alpha strike a little bit, get him with the torp, take him down. Tier 3 French tech tree destroyer Bourrasque. Bit of a different playstyle from your average destroyer, a little more challenging. Probably not the first one you want to pick up, but for those of you who are DD mains and you've been looking for something new, this is definitely it. Let me know how you're building this boat down in the comments below. You running AUBOYNEAU or you're running Voilette with a more of a gunboat focus? And what are your thoughts on the rest of the line? Hope you guys enjoyed it, and remember, stay salty, Commanders.